Today we're going to talk about the basics of doing a building permit in Ontario. A building permit is essentially something you're going to apply for because you are seeking permission to complete the work that you have in mind. So let's just talk about one of the most typical things that people will apply for a permit for, which is duplex conversion. Some of the people that you may need as part of this process is the architect, engineer, HVAC, and some other people who are going to be making contributions to what this project is going to look like in entirety. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind here is that bigger corporations who are doing this on a professional level may have a designer. Some people make the mistake, in my opinion at least, of giving the design element to the architect, which architects can do this. However, if you are a real estate investor, you ought to be keeping a little bit of control over what is supposed to be happening here or what your vision is, because if you are the investor, you have control over the money. You shouldn't be allowing somebody else to be completely responsible for the returns you make on your project. So before applying for this permit, the first thing that you're going to do here is you're going to come up with your design. Now, after you've scribbled down your designs and have a pretty good idea of what you would prefer to have, you're going to take this to the architect and they're going to draw it out and they're going to tell you what you can and cannot do, hopefully within a degree of reasonableness, and they're not just going to scrap your entire drawing saying this is ridiculous, we can't do this. But they are going to liaise with the rest of the power teams and they're going to say what is required in order to get your building permit. Now, I know some real estate investors like to stay a little more involved and they want to do the building permit application themselves, taking the drawings from the architect and making their own submissions. Now, the second thing you're going to do here is you're going to dig a little deep into the scope of work. In other words, are you doing a lot of plumbing? Are you doing a lot of electrical? Are you making the basement any deeper? Are you building a separate entrance? What is the extent of the work that you're doing? And that will lead to how many permits you're going to need. For example, if you're doing electrical work, you have to apply for an ESA permit. Now, the third thing you're going to need to do here is finalize everything that we just talked about and actually apply for your building permit. This is, of course, assuming you haven't started any work yet. Because if you have started any work and they did stop you for any reason, then you're going to have to pay a slightly higher application fee depending on where you are. At least in most of Ontario, that is the case. Now, technically what happens here is the architect, assuming they're the one applying for the permit for you, is going to go back and forth between the city and they're going to figure out what is okay, what is acceptable, and what is not. Now, generally speaking, if you have a good architect, there shouldn't be a lot of back and forth, and assuming your permit isn't unnecessarily complicated, you should see a pretty smooth process here. But I usually like to budget a couple of months here, but that doesn't mean that you have to be completely idle in what it is you can and cannot do. But now we're going to talk about the fourth thing, which is getting the work started and the sequence of work to be completed. So you started your application process, but we usually like to budget a little bit of time for that application process to go through its administration. It can take a couple of months, it can take half a year. We've had some permits take us an entire year. But what are we going to do? Are we going to be doing absolutely nothing to the property? No. There's a few things that you can get started with, or that we prefer to get started with, at least because we have experience. We work with contractors that aren't going to do anything stupid and that isn't going to interfere with our permit application. For example, if we're not worried that our permit is going to be entirely chucked, saying that none of this is acceptable, there's a few things that we can get started with. For example, if we buy a property that needs to be cleaned out in general, has some exposed walls, we can maybe get started with certain things. Maybe some waterproofing, running electrical wires that are not connected to the electrical panel, getting up some partition walls, changing out some of the rotten wood from the frames. There's all kinds of things that you can get going with, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to cover anything up, because the whole point of going through the permit process is that the city is going to send an inspector to check out the work to make sure that things meet building code. So where we usually like to stop is we don't insulate anything and we make sure that everything is very visible. As a general rule, I find that as long as you have your construction site clean and that you can demonstrate that you have a competent crew there that is making the best effort they can to do things by the book, because sometimes with these old properties, it's really hard to make them perfect, but you need to be making every effort you can to correct things that you can see. And as long as you're making as many of these corrections as you reasonably can, you're going to have an easier time with these inspections. Now, the next thing I want to talk about here is the inspection points. The inspector is going to want to see certain critical things along the way of your project to make sure that everything is moving according to the permit. So if your permit is extensive and let's say has some kind of structural work, you're going to need to make sure that the structural final work is visible to the inspector. If you have to pour foundations, for example, make sure to dig the hole, call the inspector, let them see it, and then they can see how thick you're pouring the concrete, because that's what they're going to want to see. If you're doing LVL and you're doing any kind of support going horizontal, you're going to need to have that exposed and make sure that your vertical point loads are visible as well, so that they can see that everything is properly supported. If you don't know how to do these things, again, make sure to be working with somebody who does. It's important to inspect structure, framing, fire separation, electrical, plumbing, and then you go into the next stages, which is the drywall stage. The drywall is also going to get inspected because they want to make sure that you're using drywall appropriately for fire separation. And then we're pretty much moving into all the cosmetic stuff, where the cosmetic stuff doesn't need a lot of inspections until pretty much the very end. You're going to have a final ESA inspection at the end when you're starting to do all your connections of the electrical, and they want to see that it's all done properly. And then your plumbing inspection, where they're going to look at the traps to make sure that all that is according to what you had initially started. So if you want to know more about how to do these in specific stages, tailor it to your specific project, make sure to get in touch with us, because we do have coaching and training about how you can be a real estate investor. Until then, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you on the next one.